From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
That's a lot of people, Utah, I'll tell you what. We're going to be here for a couple hours. Get comfortable. Bring the best libs that Utah has to offer.
A packed amphitheatre on a hot day, with a charismatic speaker dressed in a white T-shirt emblazoned with the word freedom. This was the first stop on Charlie Kirk's America Comeback Tour. But the euphoria of the crowd quickly turned to horror.
You guys okay?
All of a sudden, I heard just one pop. Saw Charlie all of a sudden, his head kind of fell back, and blood was just gushing out of his neck.
It is being called a dark moment for America. The targeted shooting of conservative political activist Charlie Kirk during an outdoor event at Utah Valley University.
It is my great dishonor to be the person that says this and breaks this to you on television, but President Donald Trump is announcing on Truth Social, the great and even legendary Charlie Kirk is dead.
I am filled with grief and anger at the heinous assassination of Charlie Kirk on a college campus in Utah. Charlie inspired millions, and tonight, all who knew him and loved him are united in shock and horror.
With America still reeling at this latest assassination, many are asking, is this the new normal? Why is the country plagued by political violence? And for those who didn't know him, who was Charlie Kirk? And why was he so influential among the American right? The story today: the assassination of Charlie Kirk.
I'm Katy. I'm the Washington editor for the Times and Sunday Times and a columnist for the Sunday Times. I've been in Washington, D.C. for about 4 months, obviously covering politics both here and across America.
Katy, while you've been in Washington, you've sort of become our in-house expert on all things MAGA. And in understanding the MAGA Trump universe, you've met a lot of the characters who populate it, and one of them was Charlie Kirk. Tell us how you met him.
Yeah, so on moving to Washington, D.C., having covered British politics for about a decade in Westminster, and you're getting your head around all the characters, all the senior figures, and you might think you start with Trump's cabinet, the US president and his appointees. But there's also lots of these very influential figures when it comes to the Make America Great Again movement who are not in official roles, but they're the voices that the administration often listen to in issues. And one of the names that just kept coming up and was very clear to me had a huge impact on US politics. I'd heard of him before I moved here, but definitely from being here, it became clear how influential was Charlie Kirk. And Charlie Kirk was ultimately an organizer. He founded Turning Point, which is a youth movement on the right, in 2012, but it's in recent years that it's really gained a lot of traction. And therefore, Charlie Kirk's influence is not just, I think, part his links to the White House, the fact he was close to the president, had a close friendship with the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., but also the fact that because he had such a huge presence online in terms of the number of followers, millions on TikTok, in terms of the number of views his videos would receive, the debates he would have on campus, which I'm sure we'll go into, he had a level of reach, which meant that if he said something, it mattered to the MAGA movement, and therefore it had to matter to the administration.
And where exactly did you meet him? And just for people who haven't watched his videos, just describe what he's like and what it was like meeting him.
Yeah, so he's not really a creature of Washington, D.C. So to find Charlie Kirk, you almost have to go out into wider America, which obviously journalists should do anyway. And I saw that he was having a big event, this Turning Point Summit in Florida back in July, which was a gathering of lots of students, not ones who necessarily attended higher education in Florida. They were all just going there for this big meet. And it had lots of big names on the roster: Pete Hegseth, Chrissy Noem, members of the cabinet, and influencers and so forth. So I just got in touch. I DM'd him on X, spoke to his team, and they said, yeah, come along. So I sat down with Charlie on a few occasions over the course of the weekend. And I mean, the whole thing was an eye-opening experience, because you arrive and it is a conference centre full of the young right. In the UK, a lot has been made of the fact that the young tend to be left-wing. Perhaps that's changing slightly now with reform. That's something I discussed with Charlie Kirk. But you had lots of these very enthusiastic teens all gathered there, red caps, Trump caps. But all actually, when you spoke to them, the reason they were there was Charlie Kirk. They'd seen these videos. And as for what he is like both on video and in person, well, he's developed this cult following and this very loyal mass following because he would just go and debate. So he would just turn up on campuses and he would, in a fairly open fashion, find liberal students and often tell them they were wrong. He had this segment called Prove Me Wrong. But he would do so in a way where he'd say, oh, let's be even-handed. I'll be polite back. I think that kind of logical calmness and going through these arguments, whether it's videos he is posting on why he doesn't believe in abortion or interacting with students who would say America's racist and he'd just slowly take them down, develop that following. In person, he was, very polite. He was clearly a man on a mission.
He did have a remarkable following. He's a 31-year-old, never been a professional politician, but, as you say, his big event in Florida draws people like Pete Hegseth, big figures from the Trump administration. Give us a sense of how significant a figure he'd become. How big was his following?
There was a survey by TikTok looking at amongst, Trump supporting figures, the young, who was their most trusted voice, and it was Charlie Kirk. You also had Donald Trump after the 2024 election result, crediting Charlie Kirk for helping make that possible, saying that he had helped to deliver the youth vote. And when you look at the swing votes and, which groups moved most in favour of Trump in that election, I think after Hispanics, it was the young. Of course, there are still lots of young who voted Democrat, but in terms of some of those key battleground states, and that's one of the things Charlie spoke to me about, such as Michigan, there was a feeling that Turning Point and Charlie Kirk had managed to move the young enough to the right that it was really having an impact. It's also one of those quite funny ones where I'm in my mid-30s. If you mention Charlie Kirk to someone perhaps my age, they would know him. I think a couple of years older. He is not a household name, particularly in the UK. But you speak to anyone in their kind of teens, 20s in the UK, they are very, very likely to know him. He is someone who is a phenomenon, really, in America and with the young, but yet does not exist in the minds of people in other ways.
I have to admit, here in the newsroom, it was lots of people coming in saying their children had alerted them to the fact that Charlie Kirk had died, because he clearly is known by young people in the UK too, even if he's not a household name.
Yeah, and that was one of the things too. I mean, even when I suggested doing this article for the Saturday magazine, there was a point of you had to slightly explain why you thought this person was worth covering, because lots of times readers would not have known who Charlie Kirk was. But I think if you look at the cabinet, they've all met Charlie Kirk at different times. The fact it was Donald Trump who effectively announced or confirmed Charlie Kirk's passing, and that message does speak to how close he was. But also, I'd speak to these teens at the summit saying, oh, who are you here to see? Is it Hegseth? Is it Riley Gaines? The former athlete who has spoken about women's sports. And every single person I spoke to said the reason they had found this event was Charlie Kirk. And I said, well, how did you find that? And they would say, oh, well, I saw one of his Prove Me Wrongs online, maybe it's TikTok, and from that they had then discovered a wider movement in terms of the Republican Party, in terms of Make America Great Again. So I think that's why when you say, oh, is Charlie Kirk one of the reasons that Donald Trump is now in the White House? I think in terms of the culture of America and the American youth, and you do have to take seriously the impact that Turning Point and Charlie Kirk's leadership have had, because walking around that summit, it was like nothing I had seen in the UK. One of the reasons Charlie Kirk started Turning Point and managed to find donors very quickly for it was this feeling of they wanted to stop what they saw as cancel culture, wokeness on campus, and having these organizations where lots of students say, well, I feel at home here because I feel like I can say how I really feel, why they were pro-life, why they were anti-abortion. A lot of the students were talking to me about why they hated gun control and the fact that they felt that it should be more liberal in terms of being able to own guns. Immigration was one that kept coming up, and there was just a sense that this was a space for discussion.
Those are all positions that Charlie Kirk has espoused. Give us a sense of some of his more controversial points too, because he's certainly a divisive figure.
Charlie Kirk was an incredibly divisive figure, and, we are speaking the day after he was shot. And of course, you had the initial outpouring of figures saying we're all coming together, consensus, Democrats being nice. But quite quickly, you look at certain places online, there are pretty foul messages going out from some on the left about Charlie Kirk, and on the right too about their view of the left towards Charlie Kirk. And you can see that this could turn quite bitter. When it comes to, I suppose, Charlie Kirk controversies, he would pitch himself as a free speech champion, but lots of his views made students feel very uncomfortable, hence why they went to debate him often. He had views on trad wives, for example, also the need for women to have children. I think he has some comments about, feeling a bit sorry for women in their 30s who had left it too long.
Young men are ordering their life correctly. They want to first and foremost have children, get married, and then have a nice job or to be able to travel. If you look deeper into this data, it's completely consistent with other data we've seen the last couple of years. Young women, they don't value having children.
He had strong views on abortion and why he was opposed to that.
It is never right to justify the mass elimination or termination of people under the guise of saying they're unwanted. That's how we get Auschwitz. That's how we get the greatest horrors of the 20th century. Those people are unwanted.
So you're comparing abortion to the Holocaust?
Absolutely, I am. In fact, it's worse. It's worse.
He also, around January 6th, Turning Point sent some buses of their activists to the January 6th event. He's also spoken about, for example, vaccine skepticism on COVID.
The stories are mounting of young people that have got the vaccine and then have unusual health events afterwards. At Turning Point USA, we are going to give it everything we have to make sure that students are not going to have to live in a medical apartheid because they don't want to get the vaccine.
Another thing that happened at this Turning Point summit was he had his friend Russell Brand there. Russell Brand was someone that he had befriended for a few years now. Charlie Kirk was an evangelical Christian, and I think that was a big part of what informed his political views. Again, God in America is a much bigger thing in politics than it is in the UK. And certainly at the summit, most of these students, not all of them, they were Christians. And I think one of the reasons he had bonded with Russell Brand, because I was then taken in to watch them have this podcast recording between Charlie Kirk and Russell Brand.
How was that?
It was interesting. It was a strange experience, having obviously seen the UK perspective on Russell Brand, and obviously he's facing a court case coming up, and Russell Brand having gone from quite a mainstream figure on TV to quite a fringe figure with his views on COVID and so forth. And then he was being embraced by MAGA and Charlie Kirk at this event. And lots of Americans saying to me, oh, what a smart Brit. You Brits, you must be so proud of your fellow Brit.
Wow.
And he was talking about his journey to finding God. And that's clearly what Charlie Kirk and Russell Brand had most bonded over. But they also talked about COVID and the new media and how you couldn't say certain things in the main media, but they were finding the ways to get their conversations out. So that was an aspect too.
So with views like that he's very good at expressing in forums where young people are going to see them and are going to be impressed by them, he is credited with, helping Donald Trump win the White House. Give us a sense of how influential he's been since then to Donald Trump. Because, there were always rumours that he was one of the people who encouraged him to pick J.D. Vance as the VP. Did he really have that much power?
So at Donald Trump's inauguration, it was noted that Charlie Kirk seemed to have a better seat than any member of Congress, which I think spoke to his level of influence. And that is part personal relationships. In Donald Trump's first term, Charlie Kirk visited the White House several times. I think when it came to the second term, at that point, Charlie Kirk was such a force of nature that when you think almost about the MAGA sphere, I would say are the figures who They don't have official roles, but they can be almost gatekeepers on the movement on your grassroots. So I would put Charlie Kirk in there, Tucker Carlson, and probably Steve Bannon would be some examples. But they all live in the new media spectrum. I mean, Charlie Kirk was sometimes on Fox News, to be fair, but where they have grown their followings is online, away from the mainstream media. And I think with all those figures, if the base starts to be unhappy on something such as Epstein, so for example, a lack of disclosure, a feeling that the documents or the deep state was at it, or for example, Iran and intervention and whether there should be the Iranian strikes, what figures like Charlie Kirk were saying mattered a lot to the White House. And there would often be reports of White House figures reaching out to Kirk and others to say, oh, go a bit more easy on us. Or, for example, here's our thinking. Can you help relay this to the base type thing? And when I spoke to Charlie Kirk, I said to him, how do you balance the sense that in many ways you're a Trump loyalist, but you have your own opinions, so you have to side with everything Trump says? And he was saying, no, within the family, within the movement, we're all allowed to disagree on certain things. He said he was far more critical, for example, on US support for the Ukraine war than the president, but he still felt he was able to say that. On Epstein was an interesting one because the weekend I was at this summit was when there was a big row over Epstein. And at one point, he was being quite critical of Trump's attorney general on the issue. But then later, a few days later, he said, actually, let's calm this debate now. Then he went and started speaking about it again. There was a sense that, yes, he was a supporter of Donald Trump, but he was also someone who had his own following, and therefore it wasn't just that they liked him. You also needed figures like that to not turn against you when it's issues that Trump's natural supporters care about in the America First movement.
So he had his own sort of power base, and that seems to come from the youth. It seems to come from students and explains the reason he toured campuses in the way that he did. Take us to earlier this week and Utah. This was the start of a new tour across the country that he was launching. How controversial had it been?
I think with Charlie Kirk, there's always been controversy because ultimately what he does is he turns up at college campuses and he has debates. And in some cases, mini fights, not physical fights, but he is going there to be controversial. He recently got parodied in a South Park episode. And in that episode, what they were sending up slightly was the fact you have a 31-year-old professional speaker going and debating teens and then saying, I won. But people watched it and people wanted to engage with it. And lots of people liked the fact that he would listen at least to what they're saying and then go back and forth on it. But he's done so many of these events that I don't think there is a sense that this was particularly controversial compared to previous appearances. Now, we're obviously still getting more details from what happened, but this was the beginning of a new tour of dates of doing this. And one of the things they were talking about, trans people and gun ownership. We know that Donald Trump has been critical of parts of the administration since recent shootings, suggesting there could be tighter rules around that. But somewhere within this conversation where lots of students had turned up to hear Charlie Kirk, a gunshot is fired, and then you have students fleeing scenes, Charlie Kirk taken to hospital, and after a few hours of people nervously waiting, confirmation that he has passed away.
And Katy, as we speak, there is still a manhunt ongoing. Nobody has been arrested and held for the killing. Take us back to Wednesday afternoon. I mean, how did you hear about the shooting and what was your initial reaction?
Well, the first we heard about was just X, the sense that people were saying unconfirmed reports, Charlie Kirk may have been shot. Then I had a call from someone on our team saying, we're keeping an eye on this Charlie Kirk situation. And then you immediately see people saying, there's been a shooting. Initially, it wasn't clear if he had been hit. Then, obviously, as more details came out, it began to sound more and more serious and more bleak. In terms of the coverage, particularly on certain channels like Fox News, there was no other news after that. As soon as there were reports that he may have been shot, it was round-the-clock Charlie Kirk news. There was no cutting away for other stories, which I think is just testament to how important Charlie Kirk is seen on the right of politics in America.
Katy, when the news broke that Charlie Kirk had actually died, it came from Donald Trump making the announcement on social media. Talk us through Donald Trump's reaction.
Donald Trump's reaction was to, first off, praise Charlie Kirk as an amazing human being. how brilliant he was, how important he was.
He fought for liberty, democracy, justice, and the American people. He's a martyr for truth and freedom, and there's never been anyone who was so respected by youth.
And also to hang the flags half-mast at the White House in tribute to Charlie Kirk. Now, there could be more in the coming days. We know J.D. Vance, the vice president, is heading to Utah, where the shooting took place. So I think that obviously we have the state visit next week, but in terms of what the administration is going to be talking about in the coming days and where their focus is, I think it'll be a lot on Charlie Kirk. And some will say, well, what is the response? I've seen someone say, oh, is it going to be gun control? I very much suspect that won't be the case.
No.
But they will be looking at ways to remember Charlie Kirk and protect his legacy, but also potentially some retaliation. I mean, the fact that obviously things may change after time of recording, but the shooter has still not been located. This story is not going away anytime soon. And I think that when it comes to the feelings amongst people in MAGA about this, speaking to some last night, I think there's a state of shock, certainly, but also there's a feeling that for the MAGA movement, they saw Charlie Kirk, who, yes, was a controversial figure and was adversarial in some ways, but they saw him as someone who actually went out and spoke to the other side. You know, his whole career was going and speaking to liberals and having those conversations, having those debates. Now, both sides would get something from saying, oh, Charlie Kirk slays a liberal saying, look how awful Charlie Kirk was. But it was a conversation. And I think here in America that often there aren't those conversations. It can be so polarized that the two sides aren't even talking. So I think for many, they see Charlie Kirk often going to these campuses and having these debates with liberal students as something which was there to praise and was noteworthy. So for him to effectively have been killed doing that, it's really hard to state, you know, how shocking members of the administration and MAGA find it.
And there's been a really interesting sort of shift in tone. You know, people will remember Donald Trump's statement after the assassination attempt against him, when he seemed really shaken and talked about the need for political language, you know, for people to be a bit more restrained than they have been, but sort of across the board. This time, he has been very open about singling out what he calls the radical left.
For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today.
He seems to be blaming them for what's happened, even though obviously there is no arrest made yet and we don't know who was responsible. And we should say that Charlie Kirk did have enemies on the far right too. Was that unexpected?
I mean, I think some are saying, would we get a message of unity from Donald Trump? But I think for the reasons I just spoke about, which is that level of shock in the MAGA movement, this feeling that Charlie Kirk was one of the figures in the movement who would actually go and speak to the other side and was so well liked. Everyone would say, oh, he was so friendly, he was kind-hearted, he had friends all across, he was friendly with some journalists. I mean, I wouldn't say he was particularly friendly with Democrats. I asked him when I interviewed him, I said, you know, do you have any friends who are Democrats? Which Democrats do you like? And he said, you know, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK. Now, of course,
both members of the administration.
Okay, which Democrat roots. But that, I think that does tell you there are limits to how much, you know, it was really reaching out across the divide. But he was seen as very polite and pleasant and well-mannered with these groups. And therefore, I think that it is now just potentially spilling into what could be a very messy chapter with figures in the MAGA movement feeling as though a well-liked member who did the most outreach, really compared to most of them, was ultimately killed. And as you say, we do not know who by, but there's already a narrative of the intolerant left. And I think that is where it is going. And I think that's reflected in what Donald Trump said, but that's also the feelings in lots of the, you know, the members of MAGA right now.
And Katy, Donald Trump talked about the rise in political violence in America, which seems to be such a huge feature of political life now.
From the attack on my life in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, which killed a husband and father, to the attacks on ICE agents, to the vicious murder of a healthcare executive in the streets of New York, to the shooting of House Majority Leader Steve Scalise and 3 others, radical left political violence has hurt too many innocent people and taken too many lives.
Talk us through some of the examples that he cited and also some of the ones that he didn't. Just give us a sense of some of the recent instances of real violence.
Well, of course, it's always been the case in America that you do have shootings, whether they're high school shootings, whether it's shootings at places of worship. But I think when we're talking about political violence, there have been some notable episodes recently. If you look, for example, back in April, you had Republican headquarters. You also had Tesla dealerships when there was anger at Elon Musk, ultimately being firebombed. There was talk then of domestic terrorism. You also had, an arsonist setting fire to the Democrat Josh Shapiro's mansion while his family slept inside. Another example of political violence, really on both sides. And then in June this year, you had Melissa Hortman, the former Minnesota politician, and her husband shot dead, and you had other figures of Minnesota political figures facing attacks around that time. So it's clearly febrile in terms of the mood in American politics. You can't really put one trend on it all. There's always individual factors in each of these. But I think with the Charlie Kirk shooting, it does feel as though we're potentially at a point where there's going to be a further escalation in terms of those factors that could lead to further tensions. And, unfortunately, there is, of course, as we have seen in recent months, and now risk of more political violence to come.
And Katy, you travel around the country, you watch the political scene. What do you think is leading to that sense of political violence being so much more common than it used to be? Is it the sort of the change in the style of debate? Is it the political discourse? Is it the division? What's happening?
I think there's lots of factors. I mean, of course, one that figures in the UK we'll always talk about is gun control and, the access to firearms. I think there's also just a sense of polarization in politics. And as you say, I think that the debates have become louder, more often talking to your own side and more visceral. And that's why there's a certain irony in terms of what we've just seen happen this week, because Charlie Kirk was one of the few figures who would actually go out and speak to the other side. When South Park parodied him, you've had recent South Park parodies of members of the administration who will come out and say, "This is awful. How dare South Park?" Charlie Kirk decided to see the funny side, even though it wasn't particularly flattering, and made it his Twitter profile. And I think, I think back to that Turning Point summer and speaking to some of the young girls who were there. They were just so excited and almost like giddy to be there. And one of the girls who was about to start at university was saying to me that what she really liked was they were having all these kind of workshops on how to prepare yourself to meet people with different views if you're going to a blue state university. But she said that she hoped from being there that, the right and the left could find more common ground. And sadly, I feel that this week it feels probably further away after what's just happened.
That was Katy Balls, our Washington editor. You can find all the latest on the investigation and the political fallout from the assassination of Charlie Kirk online at thetimes.com. The producers today were Shabnam Grewal and Micaela Arneson. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with more over the weekend.